An organizational culture is defined by its overall structure and the behavior of its members. Some of the main components of an organization's culture include its mission, the formally and informally communicated standards for employee behavior, and the resulting employee behavior. An ethical culture is one in which the organization consistently communicates and upholds appropriate standards for ethical conduct, and in which the organization's members willingly and consistently do the right thing. To effectively promote an ethical culture in your organization, it is important to understand the actual culture you're working with. That is, you need to understand what standards your organization succeeds in communicating to your employees, how your employees behave in both ordinary circumstances and during critical events, and what motivates your employees to behave as they do. In addition, you need to understand the aspirational culture that organizational members would like to belong to. This information will help you cultivate an ethical culture that resonates with employees and that inspires them to consistently do the right thing. To this end, this course will provide participants with a framework to gather and analyze data that will help you gain this knowledge about your organization. It is important to note that this course will only provide a quick overview of this complex process, and that this training will not provide you with the level of knowledge held by ethics professionals. However, in cases where your organizations lack resources to support an ethics office or to bring in ethics professionals, this training will give you a stronger foundation for gathering and analyzing the information needed to monitor your organization's culture. Some topics we will cover include an overview of the data you will need to conduct an ethics assessment and the significance of each data point, a discussion about how to effectively gather the information you need during the interview portion of the data gathering, including guidelines for how to choose who you will interview and who will conduct the interviews, how to prepare interview questions, and suggestions for how to gain trust from employees. A discussion about the importance of confidentiality throughout this process, and guidelines for analyzing the data from the interviews and organizational documents to yield useful information about what your actual organizational culture looks like. We will start with a discussion about the data you will need to gather during the data collection stage of your ethics assessments. To learn about your organization's culture, you will need to gather a wide variety of information from interviews, focus groups, organizational documents, and other information that indicates outside constraints on the organization. Some of the organizational documents you will need include job descriptions, organizational policies and procedures, meeting minutes, human resource documents such as performance reviews, entrance and exit interview notes, and incident reports, organizational charts indicating supervisory relationships, decision-making processes, and relationships between business units, and financial information such as allotted budget for each business unit, pay charts, how much is spent on what items, how much revenue comes into the organization, and where revenue comes from. Some information you should gather to become familiar with outside constraints on the organization includes laws relevant to the organization's activity, constraints on grant money and other needed resources, recent news or other information that indicates stakeholder perception of the organization, and cultural norms that shape employee and stakeholder expectations. This information has two purposes in your ethics assessment. First, it will help you interpret the data you gathered in your interviews and focus groups and put it into a broader context that will help you understand what created the situation employees describe. To see why this is important, consider the following example. Suppose you're having an interview with Sam, who claims that in order to carry out all of his job responsibilities, he sometimes has to cut corners in certain ways that compromise the safety of his team. After asking Sam to outline his responsibilities, you can compare his verbal description with his written job description. If Sam's verbal description does not match his written job description, you should try to determine what caused the discrepancy. There are a number of possibilities. First, it's possible that Sam's supervisor makes additional demands that are not in Sam's formal job description. Second, it's possible that the additional responsibilities belong to another job role, but Sam took on those responsibilities. He may have done this for a number of reasons, including the job role not being currently filled, Sam viewing the employee in that job role as incompetent, or Sam feeling some other pressure to take on those responsibilities. It's also possible that Sam detected an organizational need that was not covered under an existing job role and voluntarily took on the additional responsibility. If Sam's verbal description does match the written job description, you should try to determine why Sam does not feel empowered to complete all of those responsibilities. There are also a number of possibilities here. First, it's possible that the job description includes too many duties, and even the best qualified employees would have to make compromises like the ones Sam makes. It's also possible that Sam is underqualified for the position. Finally, there is a possibility that Sam is qualified but does not have all the resources he needs to carry out his responsibilities. In this case, the facilitator needs to use organizational documents to better understand what causes this situation Sam is describing and to determine the root causes of the problems Sam outlines. This understanding is crucial to gathering information about the organization's actual culture so you can build an effective strategy to foster the kind of culture you want. There is also a second reason that organizational documents and documents outlining external constraints on the organization are useful for ethics assessments. This extra data will help you look for red flags and find areas where it might be useful to implement best practices. For example, when reviewing this information, you might uncover a situation in which the organization's policies and procedures are incompatible with legal or grant requirements, or areas in which the organization fails to include legal or grant requirements in descriptions of employee obligations. Reviewing this information might also help you uncover a decision-making procedure that is inefficient or unlikely to yield the appropriate result. By reviewing organizational documents and outside constraints on your organization and measuring that data against best practices, you may be able to find areas in which your organization can improve. Now that you have an idea about the kinds of data you need for an ethics assessment and why these types of data are important, let's discuss some of the strategies you can use to effectively plan and lead interviews and focus groups. An interview is a guided discussion between one or more facilitators and one employee or stakeholder. A focus group is a guided discussion between one or more facilitators and a group of employees or stakeholders. For the purpose of this course, I will only discuss interviews. However, all of the guidelines for how to prepare and lead interviews also apply to focus groups. The goal of conducting interviews is to gather crucial information about what employees expect from their organization, what they believe is expected from them, and what motivates them to behave as they do. We also want to find out what resources they think they have that will empower them to behave ethically. If the facilitators cannot talk to every person in the organization, they should do their best to get an adequate sample of people from each business unit and at all levels of the organization, from entry-level employees to board members. The goal is to determine what responses you could expect from the rest of the organization. After drawing up a list of those you wish to talk with, you should determine who should facilitate the interviews. As you think about the candidates for this task, you should remember the goal of these discussions: to get accurate information. In order to do this, you need to think about who can gain enough trust from the interviewees that they will be willing to answer the questions openly, honestly, and completely without fear of retaliation. The best way to achieve this is to bring in someone from the outside of the organization who has a reputation for confidentiality and discretion. This person should then compile a report presenting the information gathered from the interviews that has been sanitized. That is, a summary of the relevant information about what claims were made that lacks information about who made those claims. In very small organizations, it may not be possible to sanitize the information in this way due to the fact that presentation of the crucial data will be enough to indicate who made what claims. In this case, the outside party would also have to be responsible for analyzing the raw data and presenting a report describing the organization's culture. In cases where it is not possible to bring in an outside person to conduct the interviews and focus groups, you should think about who can best achieve the goals associated with this stage of the data collection. That is, who can gain the trust of employees, gather accurate information, and maintain confidentiality. To this end, you should avoid using an employee's immediate supervisor to head his or her interview. More importantly, you should avoid using anyone who has shown a lack of discretion in the past. When preparing the list of interview questions, you should constantly keep in mind the goal of the interviews: to gain accurate information about what employees expect from their organization, what they believe is expected from them, what motivates them to behave as they do, and what resources they think they have empowering them to behave ethically. In addition, you may want to gather information about what changes employees would like to see in the organization. To gain accurate information about these things, it is important that the interview questions help establish a rapport between the facilitator and interviewee, are clear and simple enough for the interviewee to understand, and call for answers that will yield the desired information. The facilitator should start with questions that put the interviewee at ease and demonstrate the facilitator's interest in the employee's feedback. Here are a few examples of what such questions might look like. What brought you to this organization? What are your personal goals? How do these goals relate to your job? How do they relate to the organization as a whole? Does the job and organization match what you expected before starting? Why or why not? What do you like or dislike about the job and the organization, and why? These questions have a dual purpose. They can help yield useful information, and they set a tone in which the employee is comfortable speaking openly. While these questions may work for you as written, it is important to keep in mind that you may have to write your own questions or adapt the sample questions to fit your organization and the broader regional culture. After establishing a good rapport, the facilitator should ask questions about what expectations the organization has of its employees, how the organization communicates and enforces those expectations, what resources and guidance the organization provides to help its employees meet expectations, how employees actually behave, and why the employees behave as they do. Let's consider a few examples of what such questions might look like. As you read these, keep in mind that they are generic. They will need to be adapted according to who the facilitator is speaking with in order to clarify the information you hope to obtain. What does your job involve? What job responsibilities do you have? Do you feel empowered to carry out the duties required of you? Do you have the resources to carry out your job obligations? Has your job changed over time? Have expectations of you changed? If so, how? How are your obligations communicated to you? How is your performance measured? What types of behaviors are rewarded? What behaviors are punished? How does the organization define what success looks like in your role? Who do you report to? What is the process needed to gain approval for specific decisions? Where do you go to seek guidance on difficult situations? What motivates you to behave as you do? Are you aware of any misconduct in the workplace? If so, explain. What is the organization's stated mission? What are its stated values? Does that match what you see as the organization's real priorities? If I were a new employee here and you wanted to give me some insight about the organization that isn't written down anywhere, what would you say? Once again, it is important to note that few, if any, of these questions will work for you as written. You will have to adapt them to fit who you are talking to and according to the patterns of communication in your organization and broader culture. Preparing a good set of interview questions is an important step toward facilitating interviews that will yield accurate information. However, there are a few other strategies the facilitator needs to implement to achieve this goal. First, it is important to reassure the interviewee that any identifying information about him or her will remain confidential. This will help build trust and remove fear of retaliation that may prevent the interviewee from giving truthful answers to the questions. Second, the facilitator should explain the purpose of the discussion, specify the information he or she hopes to gain, and explain the way the information will be used to improve the organization. This will help the interviewee understand the intention behind the questions and offer information that is most relevant to the goals of the interview. Third, in order to ensure that the interviewee understands what is asked, the facilitator should be prepared to rephrase or clarify questions as necessary. The interviewer should also be prepared to offer examples that guide responses. In building these examples, however, one needs to be careful that they clarify the question and the desired information rather than encouraging the interviewee to give a certain type of answer that may not be accurate or truthful. Fourth, the facilitator should practice active listening techniques, asking follow-up questions whenever they help flesh out the information desired from the interview. The facilitator should also verify his or her understanding of key responses. Fifth, after asking the desired questions, the facilitator should invite further comments that none of the questions covered. Finally, the facilitator should close the interview by reiterating the purpose of the discussion, explaining how the information will be used, and reassuring the interviewee that all identifying information about him or her will be kept confidential. As we've already discussed, the interviews provide the most important data for your ethics assessments. The interviews should give you information about what employees expect from the organization, what employees believe is expected from them, what motivates employees to behave as they do, what resources employees think they have that empower them to behave ethically, what changes employees would like to see in the organization, and how employees respond to perceived unethical behavior of organizational leaders and coworkers. It is important to remember, though, that knowledge of employee behavior, desires, and expectations are not enough. You also need to think about the expectations of other stakeholders, as well as legal and financial constraints. When analyzing the data you've gathered, you should try to find out how your organization is affected by the behavior and expectations of customers and/or beneficiaries, the public's perception of your organization, common cultural practices in your region, legal and regulatory constraints, and budgetary constraints. These external constraints can dramatically affect the culture of your organization. Therefore, you need to understand how these factors affect the choices your employees make to get a complete picture of the actual culture of your organization and to determine what type of aspirational culture it would be feasible to strive for in the short and long term. Effectively analyzing this data in a way that yields a broad and accurate picture requires extensive practice and training. However, understanding some of the most common causes of ethical misconduct will help you gain the foundation to make significant improvements to your organization's culture. When an organization has an ethical mission, almost all ethical problems arise from a lack of congruence between internal elements of the organization or between internal and external elements of the organization. External elements of an organization include things that are, broadly speaking, outside of the organization's direct control, including customer and/or beneficiary behaviors, revenues, laws, constraints on grant money, and cultural and social conditions. Internal elements of an organization include things that are, broadly speaking, under the control of the organization's members, including employee behavior, allocation of budgets within the organization, frameworks used to evaluate existing or potential employees, and other organizational processes. One should keep in mind, though, that external elements of an organization can impact internal elements, and vice versa. For example, behaviors and expectations of customers or beneficiaries can shape the internal processes of an organization, including its hiring decisions and allocation of budgets. Conversely, members of a single organization can affect the broader environment by actively shaping the behavior and expectations of customers and beneficiaries, lobbying for specific laws, and cooperating with other organizations to change industry norms. When you're analyzing the information you collected in the data collection stage, you should look for cases in which there is a mismatch between various elements of your organization. Much of the time, ethical misconduct is caused by a situation in which an organization knowingly or unknowingly gives employees incentives to behave contrary to its mission and values. To see how such a situation can cause ethical misconduct, consider the following case. Suppose Sally belongs to an organization that declares cooperation as one of its core values. When Sally started her job, her priority was to contribute to the overall goals of the team, even if it meant taking on a subservient role. During her first performance review, Sally's supervisor expressed concerns that she had not accomplished anything during her first few months. As a result, it became clear to Sally that her success would be measured according to individual accomplishments that she could claim as her own, rather than by her contribution to the overall goals of the team. While Sally's behavior may not be seen as outright unethical in the traditional sense, it fails to optimally promote the overall mission of the organization, and it is not guided by the organization's core value of cooperation. However, her behavior is not caused by Sally's ill intentions. Rather, it results from her desire to protect herself from the consequences she thinks the organization will impose if she does act on its core value of cooperation. In this case, her ethical misconduct is caused by a lack of congruence between the organization's formal mission and core values and its informal culture, which punishes employees for being guided by one of its core values. Employees are also less likely to behave consistently with the organization's core values and other ethical standards if they think the organization's leaders are failing to meet those standards. In other words, employees will often wait to act on the stated ethical standards of their organization until they see their leaders following the same standards. If the employees do not see their leaders acting on those standards, they find it difficult to take them seriously. Also, it's important to note that this outcome can occur even if the organization's leaders are acting on the organization's mission and core values. If leaders do not openly discuss how the organization's stated mission and core values shape their decisions, employees are likely to assume ethically neutral or even unethical motivations on the part of their leaders. In such cases, employee misconduct is caused by a lack of congruence between the organization's formally stated mission and values and the effective incorporation of these things into the organization's informal culture. In other words, it is not enough to post and distribute documents declaring the organization's mission, values, and ethical standards. The organization's leaders also need to incorporate these standards into the organization's informal culture. One important part of this effort involves consistently discussing the organization's ethical standards and teaching employees how these standards should guide their everyday decision-making. Another common cause of ethical misconduct includes inconsistencies between written and unwritten rules regulating employee behavior. To see how such a situation can cause ethical misconduct, consider the following case. Suppose John is a risk manager for a university's athletic program, and a major part of his job description includes preventing illegal or otherwise unethical recruitment practices. John discovers that one of the recruiters is illegally offering gifts to star high school students in an attempt to lure them to the school so they can play for its team. When John reports his findings to Bob, the chief legal officer, he is told to overlook this behavior unless it is likely to be discovered by government officials, journalists, or other people who could make it into a scandal and give the school a bad name. When John pushes the issue, Bob says it is his job to minimize the risk of these behaviors to the school's reputation, not to prevent behaviors that allow the school to recruit the best student athletes. This case represents an obvious lack of congruence between written and unwritten rules regulating employee behavior, and one in which one of the parties clearly and knowingly pressures the other into engaging in unethical behavior. However, some cases in which there is a lack of congruence between written and unwritten rules do not involve anyone intentionally engaging in unethical behavior. Consider the following case. Suppose Jen is a writer for a weekly publication. The organization Jen works for has clear and detailed policies about what information should be cited and how the citation should appear. At first, Jen followed all of these rules, but her article submissions were repeatedly sent back to her with instructions to add more original material. Jen is bewildered because she thinks her work is original and that all of the information she uses from other sources is necessary to give a more complete picture of the debate she's contributing to when she makes her own points. When she approaches her coworkers about this matter, she discovers that they all face the same issue and deal with it by simply including fewer citations. This makes the editorial office see the work as more original and publish it without asking for revisions. In this case, nobody intends to behave unethically, but the final result is plagiarism. This occurs because there is a mismatch between the organization's stated rules requiring thorough citations and an unspoken rule that writers need to put in fewer citations. This mismatch is created by broad organizational procedures that regulate employee behavior rather than unethical intentions on the part of the organization's members. In other words, this case reflects a problem with the organizational system as a whole, rather than with a particular employee or group of employees. The writers do not wish to plagiarize. They do so because they want to meet the organization's expectations by producing the type of content the organization demands, and they think the only way they can push this content through the editorial office is by leaving out some citations. Also, the editorial office does not wish to make unfair demands on the writers. They act as they do because they do not wish to publish content that doesn't meet the standards of originality imposed by the organization. To address this issue, the organization's leaders need to clarify their standards and make sure there is a match between the writer's understanding and the editor's understanding of the publisher's standards. When analyzing the data you've collected for your ethics assessments, it is important to remember that most ethical problems result from a problem with the organizational system as a whole. Unethical behavior is rarely isolated in a particular employee or group of employees. Even in the university case, the chief legal officer's endorsement of clearly illegal behavior may have resulted from higher leaders making it clear that the recruitment of first-class members for their sports team took priority over other concerns. Thank you for participating in this course. As you practice collecting and examining this data, you will become more skilled in detecting ethical problems resulting from a lack of congruence between the elements of your organization. This will allow you to address the root causes of ethical misconduct, rather than coming up with canned solutions that fail to solve the underlying problems that cause the misconduct.